in the context of Israel's ongoing military operations in Gaza. My name is Janina Dill. I'm a professor of global security at the University of Oxford and the co-director of the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. Today's topic is the unfolding military conflict in Gaza, which responded to the attacks of October the 7th. To recall, in these attacks, Hamas and other armed groups killed around 1,200 people and abducted 240, 130 of whom are still held hostage in Gaza. In the 6 months since, Israel has conducted military operations and killed more than 32,000 people, a majority of whom are women and children. Several thousand people are trapped under the rubble, and 2 million people are now at immediate risk of famine. By any measure, civilian harm in Gaza far exceeds what we have come to expect from urban combat in comparable contexts, partly exacerbated by the inability of civilians to flee the theater of war and by the tactics of Hamas in commingling with the civilian population. The Israel Defense Forces maintain that these operations obey international law, and Israeli officials actively intervene in the global legal debates that have unfolded in response to this conflict. The coincidence of a systematic and often very sophisticated compliance claim with this unusually brutal and highly visible harm to civilians has put the spotlight on international law and arguably the international law community. International law is undoubtedly more relevant than ever in political and public discourse. Proceedings before the International Court of Justice and an ongoing investigation by the International Criminal Court garner unprecedented public interest. But does the conflict in Gaza demonstrate international law's indispensability as a means to make sense of the world, or its incapacity to meaningfully restrain conduct in war? The current conflict, of course, unfolds against the backdrop of historically contested wrongs and claims, which themselves raise questions that are legal and partly unresolved, such as Gaza's status as part of the Palestinian claim to statehood, Israel's status and responsibilities as an occupying power, the classification and even the temporal nature of the conflict. The question is, does international law now provide a yardstick that allows those of us who can't agree on the moral and historical context to debate productively the ongoing conflict in Gaza? Or does the legal contestability of these larger contextual questions render IHL less useful, possibly inadequate, to adjudicate completing claims about wrongdoing in Gaza now? We have 3 eminent experts today to help us make sense and answer some of these legal questions I just raised. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. To my left is Adi Amses. He's Assistant Professor of International Law at Queen's University. He's a former member of UNRWA and spent in this capacity many, many years in Gaza. He also currently represents Palestine in front of the International Court of Justice in the advisory opinion proceedings. Online is Eliav Lieblich. He's a professor of international law at Tel Aviv University and an eminent, widely respected expert, particularly on international humanitarian law and the law of occupation, topics on which he has written 3 notable books. And to my right is Vivian Salama, an attorney and a journalist who has reported on security issues for nearly 2 decades. She currently writes for the Wall Street Journal. All 3 speak today in their personal capacity only. I will engage them in a conversation of about 35 minutes, and then I will take questions from the audience. ASIL has requested that we use the app for this. I will read out questions from the iPad, so please send through your questions if and when they arise. Thank you. So to start, I would like to start by going onto the ground, the situation in Gaza itself, and start with you, Vivian. You have reported from 75 countries in the world. 85, okay, not quite up to date, and many of them difficult conflict theaters. What patterns stand out to you as specifically characterizing this conflict that we need to be aware of to make of it legal sense?
So first of all, thank you for joining me. It's not too often that I get to speak in front of, some of my peers as far as being a lawyer in addition to a journalist. So it's great to be here. We're at a turning point. I myself, I know Ardi, we've spent a lot of time in the region. Of course, Eliav is there. And from the perspective of Washington, what we are seeing is a real shift in the policy certainly in the way this war is conducted. We have never seen a war like this between the Arab and Israeli conflict in terms of the scale of it, the number of civilians who have been killed, the number, and that is on both sides, by the way, even in Israel as well. So, that already kind of shifts the conversation, but it's also sort of taking us back after some time of being fixated on, certainly myself as a journalist, being fixated on state-to-state conflict, the war, the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. Now we're looking at, again, a state and non-state actor at war with each other and civilians caught in the crossfire. Because of the scale of this, because of just the position that civilians are in, the helpless position that civilians are in, for the first time we are seeing a real shift here in Washington in terms of public opinion. And that is reflected around the world. You've seen it in protests, you see it in government rhetoric. And that is something that it has, for us, stood out significantly. Now, we are here in the capacity of talking about international law. We are at a point where we're talking about that too in new ways. Now, is that reflected so much in Washington? Not yet, not in the way that it is in other capitals, but it is starting to shift. And so that is, we are at a turning point in that regard. And I think it's a fascinating time, especially for those of you who, dedicate your lives to this, to really be able to influence those policies, the rhetoric, and to really understand where we go from here and the role that international law plays in some of these policies.
Thank you. You mentioned helpless civilians caught in the crossfire. One of the sort of characteristics of this conflict that various UN organizations and civil society organizations have highlighted is just the rapid increase of food insecurity. Eliav, if I could come to you, can you elaborate on what you think Israel's concrete obligations regarding humanitarian relief are right now, specifically in the context of claims that are sometimes contested and uncertain about operational control in parts of Gaza?
Hi, thanks. Nice to be with you, even if online. Well, IHL broadly recognizes two types of obligations in terms of humanitarian access, negative and positive. And in situations which you have ongoing hostilities with no effective control over territory, the obligations are negative. So the opposing party cannot interfere with aid by third parties, but has the so-called right of control, meaning the right to search the content for contraband or to insist on supervised delivery. Now, what is important is that this right of control should not be exercised arbitrarily. Once you exercise it arbitrarily, you might be impeding humanitarian relief, which can constitute a war crime. When there is effective control over the territory or occupation, so these obligations become positive. The occupying power must ensure the basic needs itself. Now, in terms of Israel's obligation towards Gaza in the current war, so before this war, there was a debate about whether Gaza is occupied. I know there are different positions about that, but I think, in my view, there can no longer be a debate, at least regarding North Gaza, considering the lack of civil authority there and Israel's troop disposition in the area. I think there can be no doubt that the area is under occupation. We've learned this week that the government still thinks that the area is not occupied by its submission to the Israeli High Court of Justice this week. And I think, partly this is why, in my view, Israel's argument that aid distribution in that area is ineffective because of lack of capacity of international organizations on the ground is unconvincing in legal terms, because even if they don't have capacity, this doesn't absolve the occupant from its overall responsibility. We also have the provisional measure by the ICJ, which speaks the language of ensuring aid, which means a positive obligation. And I don't want to get too technical about what this entails. I mean, beyond the need to open more crossings, the duty to ensure means the duty to ensure the distribution. And the way this is done is something that has to be discussed. I mean, one of the paradoxes of positive duties to ensure and distribute, if you take them seriously, is that they actually might require more forces on the ground to secure the distribution in a way that can actually entail escalation of military operations. And that's what I think that we really need some international mechanism to secure this aid distribution. and can discuss ways to do it. And we know the attack on the World Central Kitchen this week, which complicates these things. But I think that's the way forward, probably.
If I can just follow up, so the debate often unfolds between people who think Israel is an occupying power and is therefore held to stringent obligations to, the positive obligations you mentioned to themselves, basically to distribute aid, and those who think Israel merely has an obligation not to impede humanitarian access. Could you clarify whether you think the latest provisional measures ruling of the ICJ suggests that one or the other position is correct? And if so, whether there's anything we need to clarify legally between these two positions?
I mean, the ICJ opinion deals with, the Convention Against Genocide. So there is a provisional measure that says that there's a duty to ensure, right? And some of the judges in their separate declarations actually kind of base this also on the law of occupation. It's a bit unclear, what's the jurisdiction is there, but that's a different question altogether. I mean, the ICJ speaks to positive duty, and the ICJ provisional measure is binding. I would just add that there's an order from yesterday from the Israeli High Court of Justice that requests information about what is being done and planned in the aspect of ensuring distribution.
Yes.
Which also kind of implies that direction.
Thank you so much. If we could move on to the obligations of third parties in the delivery of humanitarian aid. Adi, if I can speak to you first about UNRWA. It's obviously become a political flashpoint. And at the same time, people on the ground tell us that its work is hard to replace by anybody else. Could you speak a little bit to the legal mandate that UNRWA is currently operating in and how these various court decisions potentially affect it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for the question. UNRWA was created by the General Assembly of the United Nations in December 1949, following the same General Assembly of the United Nations decision merely a year prior or thereabouts to partition Palestine against the interests and without consenting the native inhabitants of the country, the majority then. And as a result, it was felt by the same General Assembly who took those fateful decisions in 1947 to create a body that would see to the output or the fallout of the 1948 war. It is mandated to provide core humanitarian services today. It's lasted, despite being a temporary organization, it's lasted some 75 years or so. And the core services are what we in the agency would call quasi-governmental. 80%, 70% of the budget of the agency is spent on education, then another 20% on healthcare, and then another 10% on social services and relief services, including food aid and so on. When I say quasi-governmental in the Gaza Strip, I mean it. UNRWA is it. So the question was, it would be hard to replace UNRWA. No, it's impossible. 13,000 staff in the Gaza Strip with decades of institutional memory and an infrastructure on, for instance, food distribution, an orderly food distribution points, vehicles, fleets of vehicles, all of these vehicles, all of these distribution points, all of these installations, property of the United Nations, and therefore attracting the privileges and immunities of the UN, the staff themselves being United Nations officials, overwhelmingly, therefore attracting the privileges and immunities of the UN, and physically in the position of being in Gaza and the rest of UNRWA's areas of operation, West Bank, East Jerusalem, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, at the invitation of those host countries. So there are a series of agreements that exist that govern UNRWA's relationship with the host authorities, including with the occupying power. We call it the Comey-Michelmore Exchange of Letters of 1967. There's also the UN Charter, Article 104 of which affirms the privileges and immunities of the United Nations. There's a great, basically robust legal basis for UNRWA to be where it is and to be doing what it is doing. And it is vital that it be able to continue to do so. You cannot replace it with anything, period.
Can I ask a follow-up, which is in light of the various pronouncements of the ICJ and the factual situation as you describe it against the backdrop of collective obligations of humanitarian assistance, what do you think is the legal situation that third states face at this moment with regard to how they approach UNRWA?
Sure. In the normal course, because UNRWA's funding structure is voluntary, it's not based on assessed funding. No? States are free in exercising their sovereignty to give whatever they wish to give to the agency. Things changed on the 26th of January with the provisional measures order issued by the ICJ. Once you have the finding effectively of a plausible genocide or violation of the Genocide Convention, third states are put on notice now that there may very well be a substantial risk that genocide is taking place. So they must stop it, they must prevent it as per their standing as parties to the convention. What does that mean in real terms? Well, it certainly doesn't mean what happened, right? So I often thought it was rather odd, well, funny, but in a macabre way, that on the 26th of January, the same day that the ICJ issues its provisional measures order, less than 24 hours later, allegations of wrongdoing by 12 staff members of UNRWA, alleged to have taken part in the heinous events of the 7th of October, resulted in a number of Western states pulling their funding, the key donors of the agency. These states are all party to the Genocide Convention, so they have positive obligations to prevent, as triggered by the 26th January decision, or rather, decision, provisional measures order, and yet they pull back the funding. So this struck me as rather Orwellian, and I'm glad to say that now a number of states have come back on, the Canadians, the Japanese, and others. But it's vital, and there is a direct connection. You see this set out, for instance, in this letter that was just published just a few days ago in the United Kingdom. I think some 600 legal luminaries and others basically set out and make the connection between the duty to prevent under the Genocide Convention as attaching to third states and the provision by those third states of financial aid, political support to UNRWA and its mission, which is vital. It's the only tool in town to help mitigate what the ICJ suggests is a plausible genocide. So it's vital.
It certainly sounds, and I think we have had the factual evidence for this for quite a while, that this is an unusually rapidly deteriorating situation. It's also unusually well documented. So the fact that these provisions or the demands that international law makes really on all members of the international community, those on the ground, the potentially occupying power or not as it may be, but also third parties and states. It's an inflection point for international law, whether these are obeyed or not. And if they're not obeyed, the damage for international law might be great, not to speak of the damage for the population on the ground. But I'd like to move on a little bit and zoom out to the political context and its legal relevance, and maybe go into Israel first. So we haven't really spoken about the conduct of hostilities, but it is quite striking that how people evaluate Israel's actions from afar often depends on their attribution of intent or the purpose of actions in Gaza. This is certainly true for the allegation of genocide, but it is equally true for whether you see an evacuation of civilians or a forced displacement, an unprecedented effort to warn civilians of attacks, or a campaign terrorizing them. So how should we assess intent when it comes to state action, particularly given that in Israel there are obviously different factions also pulling in different directions? Eliav, if I could throw that question to you, can you help us understand Israel's intent and purpose in Gaza?
No, there are many fascinating doctrinal questions here about who's the state organ, where does the intention of the state lie in terms of the law of attribution. But let me kind of just maybe go off script a bit and say something more general. October 7th followed a year in which the Netanyahu government has actually tried to dismantle key state institutions, the so-called legal reforms. Netanyahu's government has so thoroughly undermined and destroyed state institutions and decision-making structures, including military chains of command, by the way, by discrediting senior command and kind of empowering this type of militia mentality. As such contempt to professionalism and accountability is acting so chaotically internally that it's almost impossible to understand what they want beyond immediate political survival. This is whether we're talking about the hostages, the strategic goals of the war, the future of Gaza. Each minister has their own idea. Some are completely unhinged. Netanyahu refuses to outline or even to discuss his own objectives beyond the very generic and impossible conception of total victory. So this is the political background. And it does affect law in a way. I mean, we know in law, as Yanina said, so intent plays a role in different contexts. But I mean, I just want to zoom in to, as maybe a case study. To me, one of the most important cases, because it's also verifiable, so to speak, on the ground, the facts are just there, concerns the displacement for North Gaza. I mean, Aisha might permit evacuations of people from areas of hostilities as a type of advance warning or in occupied territories for their own safety or for imperative military considerations. And in legal terms, what separates that from a war crime is the intent. If it's something beyond the specific objectives that Aisha outlines, that's a war crime. Forcible displacement may be something else also. Now, the Israeli military was explicit in the beginning that this is a temporary measure meant to safeguard the lives of civilians. But then we constantly see the issue surfacing in negotiations between Israel and Hamas. And we hear that in the media. I assume that's true. I mean, you can't take a legal obligation and then discuss it in terms of something you negotiate about, right? And once you do that, to me, that starts to shed real doubt on your intent. At least at a certain point in time. And this ties into this dynamic of chaos, right? The different agencies, different bodies kind of reflect different messages.
Can I ask you the other question, actually? Sorry, blame it on the day job, but it's Vivian. So I'm just kind of curious because yesterday we had a really interesting example where President Biden, frustrated by the World Central Kitchen attack, spoke with Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, both of them have very significant political considerations at play. And within hours of their conversation, it was announced out of Israel that the Erez border crossing into Gaza was open. And so it's obvious that some of this kind of can change with the flip of a switch. And so as a lawyer and legal scholar, I'm kind of curious of your view of whether or not that complicates their argument about whether or not intent is not present in terms of trying to cut aid and humanitarian aid into Gaza. The fact that it can be changed so quickly.
I didn't say that.
No, I'm asking you your opinion. I'm not suggesting it.
Look, in that case, actually, some of these measures were announced hours before the conversation with President Biden. I'm not saying that there is lack of intent in the sense that there is no state control. I'm just saying that things are just fluctuating in terms of the political considerations of people in the government in any given moment, what the polls in the morning said, what this guy on Twitter said. That's the level of events. It's a bit hard to believe. But this is my observation. It's not even as a lawyer, but as a person looking with disbelief and some of the types of governmental behavior we are seeing.
Sure.
What it arguably speaks to is the capacity of the United States to influence matters on the ground. And if there is a legal question behind that, right, which is the idea that generally the obligations of states under Common Article 1 to prevent IHL violations, but also their ability to prevent genocide depends on their capacity to influence a state.
Yeah.
And I was going to throw this question to you anyway, Vivian, whether you think that first, the non-vetoing of a resolution in the Security Council asking for a ceasefire by the United States, and now the sort of news of just yesterday, whether we should expect a change in the position of the United States on this in terms of conditioning support, and what you think that implicates in terms of the United States' legal obligations.
So I definitely think that we are seeing a change now. To emphasize that change is going to happen very, very slowly. And let me tell you, if we were not in an election year, we would be having a very different conversation. There is no question about it. I spend most of my day with politicians, and it is discouraging at the very least, if not devastating at best, to talk about the influence of international law in the face of politics and how limited the capacity is when politics can overpower the rule of law. And we talk about, everyone should be held accountable and, no one is above the law, but politics is very powerful here. And so we do have a situation now where, of course, we are seeing a shift. We saw it at the UN Security Council, although I would say it's largely symbolic, but that the US had abstained from a vote, which Israel felt very strongly about, said something about shifting perspectives, and we knew in advance that we would start seeing a shift at the United Nations. Now, Are we going to start hearing them talking about violations of international law? I do think we will at least hear them start talking about their concern, which, for a lot of people on the ground, they need more than concern, especially the civilians who are not getting humanitarian aid, and where you have humanitarian aid workers being killed as they try to deliver aid. And so you are going to see a shift as far as concern about violations of international law. Are we going to see conditioned aid? President Biden has already made it very clear that that is going to be minimal. And I say that, the Iron Dome, he said, is not going to be touched. And that has been crucial for Israel's self-defense. And it's something that the United States feels very strongly about, especially President Biden feels very strongly that Israel, regardless of everything that's happening, Israel should have the ability to defend itself, and America will always support that right. And so you will see some minor changes, whether or not it changes the course of the war or kind of forces it to a stop. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. And, as we get closer and closer to the election, you will start to see measures taken because, frankly speaking, the Biden administration and President Biden in his reelection bid is starting to take a big hit. And this, for the first time in over a decade, foreign policy is on the ballot this year. And it's because of what we're talking about right now. And so some of those measures we may see, but it's partly because, there are people within the administration who are advocating and pushing very strongly for a change. And then there's also the political factors as well. So that's something to keep in mind.
If I can ask one follow-up. So various European states that transfer arms to Israel now face challenges before their own courts. And there's generally the position is taking hold, including in the United Kingdom, that currently states transferring arms to Israel are violating their own obligations under international law. Is there a concern at all that if that position becomes more widely accepted, that there's an allegation of double standards in the Biden administration, which in other contexts has worked towards creating a reputation for upholding international law?
I mean, there's already questions. I've even posed questions to the White House very publicly, and others have as well, about concerns of whether there's a double standard. And I say that sort of as an open-ended statement because we have these two wars unfolding, almost simultaneously, essentially. I mean, the Ukraine war has now been going on for a little bit longer, but the administration was very quick to condemn the actions of Russia in Ukraine. And you had the envoy for international law going out, I forget her exact title, but she's lovely, Beth Van Schaick, out there talking about their efforts to really condemn Russia for its actions and its potential violations of international law and the investigations that were unfolding. The administration is very blatantly hesitant about doing the same and using the same rhetoric with Israel. And there's a long history, which again, it's kind of, we steer clear of international law and talk about politics and policy and influence in Washington. But I don't think I have to convince anyone here that there's a very different tradition and relationship with Israel. And the administration says that this is different because Israel is defending itself. Then the question becomes, did this conflict just begin on October 7th? Are we talking about something, this is the view that's being taken by the administration, is that Hamas waged this brutal attack and Israel is defending itself. No one is arguing that. But it's everything that came before that, leading up to this moment, and everything that's come afterwards. And when you look at it in a package, it becomes a little bit more complicated. And so that is something that the administration has grappled with for the last 6 months. And the questions have gotten harder and harder. And I offer some praise to my colleagues who are at the White House and the State Department with me, because we've tried to hold their feet to the fire as much as possible. It's not always easy, but it's something that we continue to work on to see if we can kind of get clear answers from them.
Another source of holding the feet of politics to the fire are obviously the courts. This conflict is before the courts as it unfolds like almost no other. I'd like to throw this to you, RD, and speak to us a little bit. We have mentioned the domestic courts. We've mentioned the ICC investigation and the ICJ case, but there's also a provisional measure, advisory opinion before the ICJ. Could you tell us a little bit of what you think we can learn, if anything, from the advisory opinion proceedings for the ongoing conflict in Gaza?
Thank you. Thank you, Yanina. Look, as between the genocide cases that are pending and which are tactical, And the advisory opinion, which is more strategic, you'll see it's much more deep. The advisory opinion matter asks the court a series of questions, the essence of which is whether or not Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, that is the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, is lawful some 57 years on. As we know, occupation is meant to be temporary, and occupying power can never, by law, by virtue of the occupation, be sovereign in that territory. And during the course of this 57-year period, the occupying power has been very public, open, with both its intention to maintain exclusive control over the occupied Palestinian territory for itself, and through actions taken as well. So they've got the intention, plus they're taking the actions. The question is whether or not their presence there is unlawful. If it is indeed unlawful, as some argue, then that touches on and has a ripple effect on a number of questions, including ad bellum questions, right? So Vivian mentioned earlier, the world didn't begin on the 7th of October. Yes, of course, the attack had a tremendous impact on Israeli society and was certain to include war crimes and other such. But at the same time, there was October 6th and some preceding decades there. The question is Israel's very presence in the territory lawful? Is the use of force by Israel in the Gaza Strip today a continued use of force that began in June 1967? I would argue that it is. And that the occupation, notwithstanding the debate that my dear colleague Liav has discussed, the debate doesn't really exist there on whether or not the occupied territory is in fact occupied and whether or not the Gaza Strip is part of that territory and continues to be occupied. There is a difference of opinion. I'm not sure it's a debate. One state of approximately 200 states on planet Earth regards the Gaza Strip as not being occupied on the 6th of October and in the preceding, say, decade or so. The international community as a whole unanimously asserts that the occupation of Gaza remains occupied and has never been interrupted. This includes the General Assembly, every principal organ of the United Nations that matters. So the Trusteeship Council doesn't matter, of course, in this question, but the Security Council, the GA, and so on, right? As well as the ICRC and special rapporteurs and procedures and the academics and so on. Why does that matter? Because it has a ripple effect on the legitimacy of what is happening, right? And it allows us to go deeper. So we speak of forcible transfer out of north of Gaza. And we can't look at it only through the lens of conduct of hostilities. There is an occupying power that covets that land, whose members of cabinet speak openly about taking that land for Jewish settlement, in line with what they've been doing in the occupied Palestinian territory for over a half century. That is what is at play here. It's the existential existence of the Palestinian population in Gaza that is in issue, right? So these bigger questions around the advisory opinion will have a ripple effect, I anticipate. Who knows what the court will find, really? There's some hard, difficult questions before it. But unlike the case now that South Africa has brought, where facts emerge and the law needs to be applied, but you're really not sure about how that application of the law to the facts will manifest itself, the UN record on Israel's position in the occupied Palestinian territory and its actions over a half century is so abundantly clear. They're violating 3 peremptory norms, derogation from which is not permitted. Self-determination rights of the Palestinian people who are exclusively have the right to self-determination in the whole of the occupied Palestinian territory. The inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory through threat or use of force. And finally, the prohibition on the imposition of a regime of racial discrimination that some might say, as many states have argued before the court, amounts to apartheid.
Also, I'm curious, I mean, the issue of proportionality has long been a concern in the conflicts between Palestinians and Israelis in terms of Israel's use of proportional force. And so I'm sort of, I wonder why that doesn't come in more into the question, because even after Hamas launched its attack, there was concern that Israel would respond in a way that was disproportionate to what the people of Gaza could kind of absorb, and that even Hamas as a military force could kind of respond to. And so, that has been a question in particular with this conflict. And then obviously you get into the questions of occupation and whether or not, people are not able to flee and all these other things. I'm surprised that it didn't come more into the ICJ's discussion, because I would think that would be a key element of the argument.
We'll come to speaking a bit more to
Okay,
resort
yes.
to proportionality. If you mean proportionality under the conduct of war, then it's beyond. It's beyond the jurisdiction of the ICJ, at least in the contentious case. I think it looms in the background. And we have one question from the audience about the use of very large ordnance in this very densely populated area and how that implicates IHL. But we probably mustn't expect the ICJ to help us out on that.
Right.
Adi, did you want to respond?
No, there really is no response on that. But you're quite right. Ad bellum and in bello questions separate, and the ICJ won't be dealing primarily with IHL issues on the South Africa matter. That would be contextual. That will be the essence of whether or not it's genocide on the basis of the Bosnia case.
Yeah. Before we move to the resort to force, Eliav, if I could just come back to you very quickly on the matter of courts, because one thing that obviously is on everyone's mind is to what extent there might be having an impact in Israel itself. Social scientists tell us that in most countries, when you tell people that a policy violates international law, it becomes less popular, at least on the margins. But there have been some studies suggesting that this isn't quite like how it works in Israel. Without necessarily speaking to public opinion, can you tell us a little bit of what you expect the government to make of various proceedings before international courts that concern this conflict?
Yeah, well, it's a very complex question. Let me kind of maybe answer more theoretically in general. I was teaching international law this semester, and I always teach my students that international law is a process, international legal process. That's how it works. And so, everybody was concerned about the language of the provisional orders in the first round of South Africa versus Israel. And to me, I constantly said what matters is the finding of plausibility, even more than the provisional orders, because that triggers the process, right? In which then you see this finding surfacing, in other courts, in public discussion and demonstrations. This is used to kind of ratchet up pressure. So I think there is no doubt that people in Israel as a state feels these courts looming above. They do matter. Whether they make something popular or less popular, I don't know. But definitely this had an effect. I can say, looking at the proceedings in the Israeli Supreme Court yesterday, so it's caught in the middle between, a government which is openly hostile to judicial review and the ICJ in terms of how to deal with these issues. And I think it wanted to at least portray that it's taking things very seriously. And I think that has to do also with the ICJ involvement. So that's, can't be more precise because this is kind of this need an empirical response to this question.
Yeah, sorry, it was to some extent a difficult question to answer. Thank you to the audience for posting so many questions. I'm trying to weave them in, and they also have some dedicated space at the end. But so far, many of the questions have tracked our discussion, and I'll try to come to some more. Our last round of questions here is on the resort to force. It's quite striking that in public and political discourse, hardly any statement ever begins, and Vivian already alluded to this, without asserting Israel's right to defend itself, specifically still under the impression of the attacks of October the 7th. And yet, from an international law perspective, it's not quite as clear-cut as this. So I'd like to start with Adi and asking you from a sort of jus ad bellum perspective. The claim is complicated, whether Israel has access to Article 51 UN Charter rights, the right to self-defense. Could you speak to whether you think what the complications here are, and if so, what the limits on Israel's right to self-defense are? But also, if it doesn't have a right of self-defense, how should we think of the legal basis for the ongoing conflict?
Sure. I guess the first place to start is paragraph 139 of the 2004 advisory opinion in the Wall case, where the court says very clearly that Israel cannot rely on Article 51 of the United Nations Charter as a justification for its erection of the wall in relation or in response to attacks that emanate from within the occupied territory, because that territory is controlled by it. Yeah. It also made it another argument about imputability to a state, but we'll park that for a moment. On the strength, and if this jurisprudence matters, on the strength of that, then by virtue of the fact that Israel continues and has continued uninterruptedly to be in occupation of the Gaza Strip since 1967 June, the attacks that emanate from within it do not give rise to a right to self-defense, to use force in self-defense, under Article 51, which is the most important bit of the response here. So on the assumption, of course, that position of the court, as many of you know, attracted a great deal of criticism, particularly among Western international lawyers. So I'm not oblivious to that, and we can speak about that in a moment. But on the assumption that that's still good law, and there's no reason to believe that it isn't, at least a cogent reason to believe that it isn't, then 51 isn't there. So the next question is, well, what can Israel do? And it would be absurd for anyone to even suggest that Israel is powerless under law, but to be able to respond or not to be able to respond in respect of events flowing from the 7th of October. And so there, I think that the answer, the international lawyer's answer, we go into IHL. The territory is occupied. Israel remains an occupying power. It has an obligation to maintain public order in that territory and can use force. Of course, then you get into questions of proportionality and necessity, right? And so the question then is the occupying power's response to the events of the 7th of October, where Palestinian paramilitaries attacked both legitimate targets, military positions on the border of the Gaza Strip, but also engaged in attacking, evidently, civilian objects and civilians illegally, war crimes and so on, killing some 1,100 persons and taking 250 hostage. Is it proportional or necessary to repel that attack to do what they've done since? Some 32,000 killed Palestinians, possibly over 40,000 if you count those who are buried and presumed dead under the rubble. 73 or 75,000 injured, 1.7 million people forcibly transferred, a scorched earth tactic, nothing to return to, and as indicated by the cabinet and various members of the political echelons, that it should be another Nakba, of course, just immediately after the 7th of October. Is any of that consistent with IHL? I don't think it is. So that's one line of argument. The other line of argument is arguing for Israel. There is an inherent right, leave aside 51, there's an inherent right under custom of states to respond to armed attacks that, against their territorial integrity and political independence. And of course, they would argue that the court got it wrong in 2004. Still, even if you did that and you took the position that it has a right under Article 51, you still have to go back to the in bello arguments on proportionality and necessity, and you end up in the same place effectively. What we are watching now is not in any shape, way, or form proportional or necessary to repel the attacks of 7 October. There isn't a sentient being in the land, in my respectful view, that would take that position seriously. That's a problem, and it's going to manifest itself in the courts domestically and internationally.
Adi, if I can follow up on this, and partly because we've gotten a number of questions from the audience about this, can we briefly contextualize the necessity and proportionality of the in bello response with the fact that Hamas is not obeying international law itself and arguably commingling itself deliberately in the civilian population? There's a long-standing allegation that it is using human shields.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. Well, you start from the basic proposition of any IHL, all the IHL lawyers would know. Reciprocity doesn't play in IHL. Just because the other side is violating, allegedly or truthfully, their IHL obligations doesn't mean that relieves you as an attacking party or a defending party, as it happens, of your own obligations. So let's take arguendo, the claim that Hamas has embedded itself within the civilian population, thereby rendering 2.3 million Palestinians human shields, or members of Hamas if they take up arms and participate directly and so on. Let's take that arguendo. It doesn't relieve Israel from its obligation to distinguish between civilians and civilian objects on the one hand and combatants and military objectives on the other. It's really that simple. And the hard part for any IHL lawyer or member of Commission of Inquiry, as I used to sit on the Yemen Commission of Inquiry, will be questions of fact. who has the facts at their disposal? Do they divulge those facts? It's typically the attacking party, typically the militarized, industrialized state doing this work, taking decisions with their lawyers and their legal teams, and their documents are not readily available. So all we're left with is to draw reasonable inferences based on information in the public realm from what we see. Question, is it reasonable to argue that a whole population in the most densely populated place on Earth is a human shield and therefore killable either as collateral damage or targetable if they happen to just be unable or unwilling to leave northern Gaza? As the Israelis have said, they've got these kill zones. Clearly not. Under IHL, an attacking party has a duty to distinguish and to justify their attack bullet by bullet, bomb by bomb. And you can't just throw a blanket over the whole space and say they're all human shields. It makes no sense.
The extraordinary thing is when you talk to the administration about this particular issue where you say, does Israel have a higher standard? Should Israel be held to a higher standard than a terrorist organization? And especially in the earliest weeks, what I used to get mostly in private is, well, you know, it's a sovereign decision the way that they carry out their response. And when we think about September 11th and the emotional response we had that led to the military response, you know, they're driven by public opinion. That was how we responded to, and no one could have told us otherwise. We were going to respond with force and with might to show, you know, that we had the situation under control. It's now 6 months later where we still see the civilian death toll rising, and those are when the questions start to get harsh. Of course, you on top of that have an occupation and a famine that's building on top of it, and so it is really kind of taken it to the next level of complication. But initially, the U.S. was saying, you know, technically, yes, but we can't stop them from doing it because it is their sovereign decision. Public opinion in Israel has shifted, and I saw that for myself in my recent trips. I used to live in Israel, and just going back, I mean, Ilya was there, so I don't want to speak, you know, he'd be better to speak to it, but from when I lived there, I saw an enormous shift in public opinion in Israel, where even some of the most liberal communities, Tel Aviv and elsewhere, they're angry and they want their hostages out and they don't care what their government has to do to shift it. It's just elsewhere in the world, they don't have that visceral emotional response, and they're seeing what's happening in Gaza and thinking that something has to change. And so the US is only now coming into the picture and saying, this has got to stop. But unfortunately, in the beginning, the sense was it's their decision, it's their sovereign right. They are trying, it's self-defense, and they have to do what they have to do. And so it gets complicated.
Of course, holding a country to the legal commitments it has itself made in virtue of its sovereign power isn't necessarily overriding its sovereignty or holding it to a higher standard. Right? Technically, it's holding it to the legal standard it has agreed to. And an interesting flip side to the notion of holding Israel to a higher standard than Hamas is the idea of giving it the benefit of the doubt as a democracy, right? Mm-hmm. And that we should expect it to. This is a very prominent feature in the European discourse, that we should be confident and faithful that Israel is obeying international law, where we don't even have to look that closely that Hamas is not. I'd like to throw this to Eliav and think about the resort to force on the other side, so to speak. There's obviously the ongoing argument that given the questions of the legality of the occupation, that Palestinians have a right to resistance as well. Could you tell us and contextualize this for us, how this fits into the law on the resort to force, which obviously was designed much more with the notion in mind that it states that resort to force against each other?
Yeah, so I'll do exactly what you just asked. I'm going to answer on the legal rather than political or moral levels. I mean, first of all, I want to make clear that in my view that there's a massive violation of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people before this government, but with this government does it, you know, without even trying to conceal it. We can look at the founding documents of the coalition, which mentions exclusive rights to Jews over the entire land. We can look at the appointment of an extreme settler, Bezalel Smotrich, to be in charge of civil affairs in the West Bank, including Palestinian civil affairs. We can look at annexationalist policies. We can look at, you know, settler violence. I can go on and on and on. Which have nothing to do with self-defense or security. But, you know, on the other hand, it is also clear, at least to me, you know, that armed groups like Hamas are not in fact fighting for self-determination. Not in the discourse they're using, not in their stated goals. It's certainly not reflected in the methods they're using, as the atrocities of October 7 reveal. So when people are invoking self-determination or self-defense or security considerations to justify this or that action, I think my kind of response is also, okay, wait, what is this what you're really doing, right? And this goes to both parties in this tragedy. And now, regarding resort to force, I mean, I don't have, I think Ardi summarized a lot of the things very nicely. In terms of use of bellum, there's these great two vaguenesses, resort to force by states against non-state actors, whether in occupied territories, in their own territory, in third-party states, and resort to force by non-state actors themselves, both internally and in terms of self-determination. International law has avoided taking this question head-on for probably political reasons, and I think there's a lot of whale critique leveled against the fact that that there are multiple UN resolutions and sources that discuss the right to struggle for self-determination, but it's kind of left ambiguous whether that's an ipso facto right to use armed force, and in what situations it is clear that you can't repress self-determination by force. Now, I mean, the analysis changes, if Palestine is a state, so then I think the door is open to a much kind of clearer jus ad bellum discussion. And, if the ICJ rules that the occupation in general is unlawful, then, there are grounds to say, well, the occupation is also a continuous armed attack, and whether that gives rise to a right to self-defense. But even in that case, you would have to ask, okay, so what are we doing with elements that within this unlawful occupation are also fighting for something else, which is beyond, this occupation. So I think it's hard to do justice to this question in a very limited time.
Absolutely. And I think it becomes particularly difficult for us to defend international law or interpret it when it seems like it isn't quite fit for purpose, right? It doesn't provide an adequate answer for something that we think it should, from a moral or political perspective, regulate. And I think we've had 2 points in this panel where this might have come up. And one is the question is, what are the Palestinian people supposed to do, right? What is law supposed to grant them? Eliav, if I can throw it back to you, if you see a need for progressive development, or how should we think of interpreting progressively international law with a view to clarifying this?
Look, I mean, some will say, it's a feature of international law that that's how it works. I try to deal in my scholarship with this question. I thought that maybe human rights law provides some answers to this question, because if you have a right and you attempt to kind of vindicate it non-violently, but then you get a violent response, then you might have kind of this self-defense right that emanates from your right to life, kind of like this type of conditional threat. But this is really, there is some progress, at least in scholarship, about this, but I think this is something that states historically have been very wary about.
This is when international law comes under pressure, right? When it seems to not have an answer to urgent political questions that also have a moral force and therefore get a lot of buy-in. If I could ask you, Adi, in a sort of flipping this a little bit, the question is, some people have argued, and this may be factually incorrect, but that IHL basically doesn't leave Israel a way to legally conduct operations in Gaza. How should we think of this as a kind of concrete legal question, but also conceptually about international law? What is it if when international law demands that an actor self-abandons or gives up a politically and morally urgent aim?
Great questions. Thank you. Difficult questions. Not enough time. But I shall try. I actually think that IHL is sufficient for purpose. I really do. The question is, whatever, dear friends, is the purpose? What are the war aims of the occupying power? Are they legitimate war aims, right? The IHL lawyer will tell you that the only legitimate war aim is to quash the other side's ability to use force against you. And that's why you have principles of distinction and proportionality and so on. That's why you can only attack a combatant or a military objective. It is improper, illegal to draw as a war aim the desire to crush the other side politically, to cleanse them politically, to end their political parties and so on. Then you must ask, well, whatever is Hamas? It is clearly part of the Palestinian political spectrum. It is a political party with clearly a paramilitary organization that many states in the West regard as terrorist. It's been governing the Gaza Strip for some time. It has doctors, it has teachers, administrators, and other such. And if the war aim by the occupying power is to crush Hamas, and if that war aim is regarded as lawful, then it colors how we look at the IHL questions of proportionality and precaution and distinction and so on. And so I do think that if we maintain a fidelity to the object and purpose of IHL and the law of belligerent occupation and impose it strictly and without fear or favor, regardless of who's the occupying power or who is the paramilitary or the terrorist, as you like, responding or indeed taking action that then gives rise to a response on the part of the other side. If we apply it fairly universally, it would be fit for purpose. The problem here is it's not just the conduct of hostilities issue. The occupation of the Gaza Strip has lasted for over a half century. Whatever does the occupying power want with this territory? Well, they're telling you right now, right before your very eyes. They want it, all of it. They've been very clear. I would commend to you Palestine's statement, a written statement to the International Court of Justice on the advisory opinion, and you can see the evidence for yourself. Decade after decade of Israeli leaders telling you what they're doing and doing it.
Vivian or Eliav, would you like to come into the question of whether international law is fit for purpose or political and moral purpose? I think Eliav has written on the moral purpose, but I have made him answer several questions already. Would you like to speak to the question whether international law is fit for political purpose in this context?
I mentioned it earlier, and it is discouraging at times to see how easily politics can kind of subdue the power of international law and I'm just a spectator, and I have to approach these issues from a pretty objective point of view. And it's hard to see that, just the questions of whether or not certain actions. I mean, we're talking now about the World Central Kitchen attacks of this week and a lot of claims of violations of international law. And the administration says, well, Israel admitted to a mistake, so it's not okay. Well, we go back. What about the previous attacks on humanitarian workers before that? There's now a pattern, and they told us they won't do it again. This is where we are in terms of the discourse, and it's discouraging for those of us who believe in the powers of international law. But do I think it serves a purpose? Absolutely. I mean, God knows where we would be without it. And so I think there's you're always going to be coming up against the political headwinds, but that's partly why the work you do is so important. So thank you all.
A striking number of questions that were asked through from the audience have asked us questions about language and about word choice. For instance, why we are talking about a war rather than a genocide, why we are using a term like starvation. And I think it is quite characteristic of the legal discourse, particularly around this conflict, that oftentimes in relatively sort of benign choices like this, we supposedly take sides. And I think one of the things that the legal community will have to grapple going forward, as this conflict will occupy us for some years to come, is how to step out of a discourse where it is about taking sides and being besieged, being one of one camp and not the other, rather than coming back to what international law is for, what law generally is for, which is to let the argument speak, rather than to ask who is the speaker, and to, without fear or favor, as Ardi said, put facts to law and live with the consequences. This is certainly what we have tried to do in this panel, and I'd like to thank ASIL, the ASIL committee, particularly Julian Arato, for convening us today. And we close with a wish for the profession to go forward to find a cordial yet productive manner of talking about this conflict. And please join me in thanking the speakers.